What is going on, folks? This is Nate here at Tool Dyno Works, and I am back once again with our 2024 Honda Transalp here on the dyno, and I am stoked to announce that our mail-in ECU flashing service for these bikes is finally available on our site, tooldynoworks.com, for $349.99. With the help of software developers, we were able to work out the last of the remaining bugs that we wanted to get solved before we went ahead and released our custom tuning for this bike. I'll give a brief recap here real quick of how this bike started stock, then how it was once we tuned it, and then the tuning with a slip-on and a full system, and now even with a K&N air filter installed, and it did actually make a bigger difference than I expected. So let's go through that here real quick, and then we'll get to where we're at now with our current testing. So again, I'm going to make this real quick just because we've already covered this now in a couple different videos, but this is how the bike came in bone stock. Run 14 is after we went ahead and broke it in here on the dyno, did the first service, and you can see there looking at the bottom, the AFRs are stupidly lean till about 6,000 RPMs, and the power just signs off at the top above 9,000 RPMs with the stock mapping and stock exhaust system installed on the bike. It made about 77.25 horsepower and just under 51 pound-feet of torque to the tire on pump gas. But of course, once we went ahead and got the bike properly tuned and dialed in, again, this is still the stock exhaust system installed here, run 24, the bike is now making just under 83 horsepower to the tire and about 52 pound-feet of torque on pump gas. The gains off the bottom, and especially at the top end, are just ridiculous. The graph doesn't even really look like the same bike anymore, but nothing has changed whatsoever other than our custom ECU mapping. Now, obviously, as you uncork the bike more from the exhaust side of the equation, the fueling needs go up because you have more airflow now going through the engine, but so does the performance. You can see there the green line, run 27. The bike was now making just under 85 horsepower and about 52.3 pound-feet of torque to the tire, again on pump gas, and that is a Acura slip-on installed, again, with our custom ECU mapping to match the improved airflow through the engine. You gain just a little bit everywhere. It's not going to change your life, but it is an improvement. And if you go ahead and add a Acura header to that slip-on, so you now have a full exhaust system, you can see run 28 there, that sort of purple-looking line. You're now about almost 87 horsepower, about 54.25 pound-feet of torque. You just pick up more everywhere. There is one very tiny loss right there with the airflow change with the stock headers versus the Acura header. Yeah, so you lose something just a little bit there, but you gain everywhere else. We covered that again more in depth in our previous video, so if you're interested in looking at that, please go ahead and watch that one. But this is how it all stacked up when we last posted our video here, and you can see how the bike was stock, with a slip-on, with the stock exhaust and tuning, and with a full exhaust and tuning. Okay, so that's where we left off the last time we were covering modifications for this video. Now, what else have we done since then? Well, we went ahead and added a K&N air filter. And just in case you haven't pulled yours out yet, this is what your stock air filter looks like. There is quite a bit of metal mesh here, which is essentially just a backfire screen. And well, when you have that much metal actually covering the inlet of the filter, it's going to create a restriction. But modern air filters are one of those things that people think is way bigger of a restriction than it really is. This one actually made more of a difference than I was expecting, but it's still not enormous. So run 28 there, the blue line, is how this bike was with just the full Acura and our ECU flashing in place with the stock air filter, and the red line, run 20, is now with our ECU mapping updated for the additional airflow the air filter provides. And if we specifically highlight and zoom in on some areas here, say right around like 6,300 RPMs, right in the meat of the power band, it is building some torque sooner. You're making about 2.5 pound-feet of torque more and about 3 horsepower more right there through the mid-range, and those gains do carry most of the way to the top end. At the very top end of the RPM range above 9,500, it didn't really make that big of a difference, and there's a spot there right around 8,000 where it didn't make much of a difference, but you are picking up a few horsepower and a couple pound-feet of torque through most of the rev range with an aftermarket air filter on these bikes. Which is awesome, because in my opinion, and the opinion of pretty much everybody in the tuning community for motorcycles, anything with a backfire screen like this is just stupid. With proper tuning in place, you're never going to have the thing backfire out the intake. They're just completely unnecessary. Sometimes they're there for noise emissions, but in this case, that is 100% a backfire screen that's never going to be needed, and a completely unnecessary restriction to the bike. Now, before I dive into sort of the nitty-gritty of how we've accomplished all of this in terms of tuning, let's take a quick look at how this thing was stock versus how it is now, because again, they don't even look like the same motorcycle anymore when you just look at the output on a dyno graph. Not only is there a gain of 10 horsepower peak to peak, but there is a 16 horsepower gain at 9,500 RPMs out there at the top end, and a more than 20% gain in torque and horsepower right there off the bottom around 4,000 RPMs. Again, the thing just doesn't even look or perform like the same motorcycle that it was when it came on in from the factory. But as I stressed in the last couple videos that we posted on this bike, the dyno graph does not tell you the whole story. It looks impressive, but the part throttle performance improvements are even more impressive. For starters, let's take a quick look at the stock throttle-by-wire map. This is in power mode 4, which again is your stock mode for sport mode. And you can see way out here at the 100% requested throttle column, you don't get anywhere near 100% requested throttle until about, what is that? 7,000 RPMs, and then it just pulls it away from you, which you can very clearly see on the dyno graph. But this lack of throttle input, or this restriction, goes all the way back through almost the entire RPM range, which is part of the reason why Sport mode doesn't really feel that much different than the other modes currently in the bike, so Power Mode 3, which is in Standard mode, for example. Because at wide open throttle, their maps aren't even different at all. The Power Mode in Power Mode 4 is identical to Power Mode 3 at wide open throttle. And it's very, very slightly different everywhere else. And what I've done here to show you that or highlight it for you is copy the Power Mode 3 5th gear ETV map into just Power Mode 4. And these are the percentage changes that you can see. You're talking 1, 2, 3, maybe 4% changes at the most between the two modes. And like I said, at wide open throttle, they're literally identical. And that is the same story for the lower power modes as well. At wide open throttle, it's pretty much all the same. You do have, again, some very slight differences through the mid-range, but it's not enough to make the bike actually feel like it has 4 truly distinct rider modes. So I went ahead and just scrapped them. All of them. I went ahead and modified all 90 ETV main throttle-by-wire tables for this bike. Sport mode is now massively more linear than it ever was before. Again, even describing it to you will not do it justice till you try it for yourself. The throttle response is much smoother and stronger and much more linear than it ever was previously. Standard mode is now uncorked off the bottom and all the way through the top end, but it's still a much more soft kind of casual cruising or commuting mode. So if you're going over, say, some uneven terrain or a pothole or something like that, you don't have to worry about the throttle kind of jerking you around. And then I've also went ahead and further backed off Power Mode 2 and 1, which are what is used in rain and gravel, because they were pretty useless in those modes. You could still get the thing to spin off no problem whatsoever on uneven terrain like gravel. So I went ahead and softened those dramatically and put in some pretty significant throttle limits, so you just can't actually get the thing to spin the tire up as easily when you're on wet or uneven terrain. Now, as I say that, I'm sure a lot of guys that use this for more technical riding go, oh, but you need more power when you're off-road to be able to pull the front wheel up over a log or whatever the fuck. Yeah, I understand that. So you will have no issues doing that whatsoever with our custom throttle-by-wire mapping, and especially with our custom fuel mapping. As you've seen on the dyno graphs, the performance off the bottom is night and day different than it ever was from the factory. And now that you have 4 actual distinct power modes, you can just go into user mode and pick which power mode you want. But now that I've mentioned fueling, let's talk about that, because that is a really important part of getting this bike properly tuned and dialed in, because the stock fuel mapping is fucking terrible. On the stock mapping, seeing anywhere around 14.7 or 14.8 to 1 AFR at wide open throttle is absolutely unacceptable. That is ridiculously lean, it will not create great power, it makes the combustion incredibly unnecessarily hot, and it doesn't even get back to reality until somewhere maybe around 7,500, 8,000 RPMs or so, because it's even still too rich right through the mid-range between 6,000 and 7,000 RPMs, and of course at the top end it just kind of signs off and goes off into space, but it doesn't really matter because the throttle's not even open there from the factory to begin with. Now, you can't just go into these ECUs and set a different fuel target. Unfortunately, with the incredibly antiquated narrowband O2 sensor technology still used on most motorcycles, it just doesn't work. They're not nearly accurate enough to properly adjust for any sort of fueling changes that you're requesting. So the only real solution when you're trying to properly dial in fuel mapping for any of these bikes is to just get rid of the O2 sensor. Maybe someday Honda will take a page out of somebody like BMW's book, who actually uses, thank God, modern wideband AFR sensors in their bikes instead of 1980s O2 sensors from something like an old Chevy or Ford, because again, these are that antiquated. But until then, when you're talking about getting the fuel mapping properly dialed in, you just have to unplug the thing. Get it out of the equation. We've disabled the fault codes for it, so it won't cause any check engine lights or issues whatsoever, and then you can actually get proper fueling into the bike. Now, I'm sure a bunch of you are wondering where the hell the O2 sensor is. If you follow this wire coming off the pipe, up underneath the plastics here, you just have to pull this panel, and it's sitting under there. We went ahead and actually just pulled ours out so it was more easy to access. It is this connector right here, and it sits in this rubber boot right here. It is not hard to get to. Again, just pull this panel off, and you'll be staring at it. Now, I'm sure there's a bunch of people that probably don't want to unplug their O2 sensor. And if you've got the stock exhaust still in place, that's fine. I can crank in enough fuel that it's at least safe with the additional power that it's going to make once it's properly tuned, but it's just not the optimal way to do things. So my recommendation to anybody getting this thing properly tuned, just unplug the frickin' O2 sensor. Period, end of story. If you have an aftermarket exhaust and we're having to add that much more fuel into the equation, you don't really have a choice. You cannot get enough fuel into the thing without the O2 just freaking out and trying to lean it all back out for emissions compliance with the aftermarket exhaust in place. So you don't really have a choice there. If you have an aftermarket exhaust, you want the bike fueled properly, and you have us flash the ECU for you, you have to unplug the thing. Period. End of story. And what's super funny is that when we did unplug the sensor and we found out where Honda actually set the fueling for this bike, it's kind of in the ballpark for the stock system. It's not perfect, it's about 13.8 to 1 instead of 14.8 to 1, but it just goes to show you that they had the fueling in mind to run at a much richer target than the emissions compliant nonsense that they end up having to run anyway. And for those of you that are just curious exactly how much more fuel something like a full exhaust and a K&N air filter takes with it properly tuned, it's a lot. Again, remember, I just told you that it's about 10% richer once you get rid of the O2 sensor anyway. And on top of that, in some areas of the fuel mapping, we've had to add 16 to 17% more fuel just to get the thing to run at an appropriate air fuel target at wide open throttle. So you're talking about 26 to 27% more fuel over the stock parameters. Which is why I keep stressing, like most modern motorcycles that we offer tuning for, with the exception of like the modern BMWs, if you have an aftermarket exhaust installed, you have to unplug the O2 sensor. There's no way around it. Now, you will see that several other competing tuning products out there don't have that same recommendation or stipulation. That is because they are just afraid, honestly, of making that recommendation. They full well know that getting the bike properly fueled with the stock narrowband O2 sensor, again, on almost any modern motorcycle, is a huge mistake. It just won't work. At best, at worst, it's flat out not safe for the condition of the engine. If you try to run this thing 27% too lean at wide open throttle, you're not going to have a good time. And please keep in mind that we can only make this recommendation because by the time you've gone to the extent that we have on this bike, where you have an aftermarket header, an aftermarket slip-on, a K&N air filter, you've made this bike not technically legal for road use anyway. And all of our custom ECU mapping is built for off-road use only. Now that we've covered the fueling topic on this bike, let's talk about ignition timing. The stock octane recommendation from Honda on this bike is 87 and no higher than 10% ethanol. So 87 E10 is what it says in the manual. Now, you can normally, on most motorcycles, crank in a few more degrees of ignition timing and pick up a few ponies in certain portions of the RPM range. That just isn't the case on this bike. Now, when you increase ignition timing a few degrees, you then end up having to make the recommendation of running higher octane fuel, so like 91 to 93 E10, which is most people's premium pump gas. It just didn't make enough of a difference on this bike for us to make that recommendation. Did we tweak the ignition timing mapping? Yeah, just a little bit, like to smooth out some of the curves in some spots, but it's not enough that it's actually going to require higher octane fuel. So you can absolutely still use just 87 up to E10 regular pump gas in these bikes, but in my personal opinion, for the longevity of any modern motorcycle engine, just run premium pump gas. You don't want to end up getting one tank of crappy bad fuel on these things and all of a sudden just shortening the life of your engine. It's just not worth it. The performance improvement was a 1 horsepower difference between 87, which again, actually, because it burns hotter, was slightly higher than 91 E10. So just run premium pump gas, but don't be stressed out if you end up somewhere weird or out in the middle of nowhere. You don't have the choice to do so. It's fine. You do not need to run premium fuel with our tuning for this bike, so just don't worry about it. Now, if you look on our website under the product description for our ECU Flashing Service for this bike, you will see a bunch of other maps listed on there that we do modify. I'm not really going to go over them in this video because they don't matter. There are fuel limit tables in the ECU that we have to modify. There are a couple different ETV limit tables we have to modify. There's a torque limit table we have to modify. I do increase the RPMs by like 50 RPMs just to make it idle a little bit smoother, but again, nothing that we need to go over is going to change your life. We do disable the O2 sensor fault codes. We do disable a top speed limiter because yes, folks, there is a top speed limiter on this bike. But again, it's so far out there that you're probably never going to have experienced it. If you did, congratulations, you got bigger balls than I do because I certainly never found it on the road. And lastly, while we have the ability to increase the rev limiter, we didn't choose to, because honestly, there's absolutely no reason to. If you take a look at our wide open throttle dyno graph here for how the bike sits right now, which again is as uncorded as it can possibly get, you can see that completely flat air fuel curve down there. Peak power is out here at about, 9,500 RPMs, maybe right at like 9,800, it peaks for just a little bit, and then it falls off there to the limiter, which is again stock at 10,500 RPMs. There's just no reason to go further because peak power is already back about 1,000 RPM sooner. So even if you're in a racing situation and you're looking to have a little bit of over rev, well, you've got it. You've got about 1,000 RPMs of usable over rev there. And you know what? That's plenty. By increasing the rev limiter, all we're going to do is decrease the longevity of the engine and increase the risk of there being some sort of valve float issue. And when you're not still making power at the stock rev limiter, there's just no point. Okay, and I believe that covers just about everything we do in these ECUs currently. Now, If you do have any questions about getting your Transalp properly tuned and dialed in with our custom ECU mapping, please do not hesitate to email us at support@tooldynoworks.com. We are always happy to help answer any of your questions, and I answer tech support emails personally every single day we're here. And once again, our mail-in ECU flashing service is now available for these Transalps on our website, tooldynoworks.com, for $349.99, and I can guarantee that it is by far the best money you will ever spend on your new Honda Transalp. And I can also guarantee that you will not find higher quality or more thoroughly R&D'd custom ECU mapping for these bikes from any other tuner out there. I have over 300 passes on this dyno on this bike alone with just the testing we've done so far for the stock system, slip-on, full system, and the full system with an air filter. And that number is only going to keep growing as we continue to try and test different modifications. For example, there's a couple intake snorkels in that airbox that I have a sneaking suspicion will definitely add some additional power if we remove. So we're going to test that next, and I'll be sure to share the results with you folks here on our YouTube channel, our social media, and in the specific rider groups for the Transalps. And that's all I've got time for today, folks. So once again, please, I cannot stress this enough. If you have any questions whatsoever, just email us, support@tooldynoworks.com. I'm more than happy to help. This platform is awesome right out of the factory, and it is just fucking amazing once it's properly tuned and dialed in.